Hey guys, tonight we're slipping into the candlelit shadows of medieval life. Not into the halls of power or the heat of battle, but somewhere far more intimate and far, far weirder. Picture this: a cold stone chamber filled with musk superstition and strangely enthusiastic chants. Somewhere between a monastery's cloisters and a lord's bedchamber, things are happening that would absolutely wreck your Tinder bio. From chastity belts lined with spikes, to public ceremonies that involved more nakedness than dignity, you're about to uncover just how bizarre and disturbingly creative medieval sexual culture could be. You probably won't survive this without raising an eyebrow or two, or 12. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop your location and the local time in the comments. I love seeing where and when you're listening from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're sitting beside a rough wooden table, candlelight flickering across the stone walls. There's a faint draft that chills your ankles, but the monk opposite you doesn't seem to notice. He's far too busy with the scroll. He's unrolling a parchment filled not with scripture, but with diagrams and Latin phrases that read more like coded messages than holy writ. You blink. Are those illustrations? Yes, anatomically questionable ones at that. Welcome to the secret sex manuals of the Middle Ages. Medieval people weren't just celibate monks and long-suffering peasants. Beneath the sermons and sweeping robes was a deeply sexual society brimming with desires, fears, and curious rituals. But unlike modern cultures that discuss sexuality openly, or at least pretend to the medieval world, wrapped its cravings in layers of taboo theology and sometimes flat-out weirdness. Let's start with the church. On the surface, it preached abstinence, glorified virginity, and painted lust as a direct route to damnation. But in private, priests were dealing with confessions that would curl your toes. Adulterous nobles, sex-mad widows, wandering monks who couldn't keep their vows. And then there were the penitentials, those grim little books that listed sins and their assigned punishments. If a man slept with his wife on a Sunday penance, if he did it naked and standing up, triple penance, if he thought about another woman while doing it, may God have mercy on him. These books, weirdly specific and deeply obsessive, were a window into a society that was both deeply ashamed and endlessly fascinated by sex. They cataloged every possible combination, from bestiality to incest, masturbation to forbidden positions, like a grim medieval version of Cosmopolitan. But these weren't written for pleasure. They were warnings, threats, fire, and brimstone reminders that your body was a battlefield. Yet somehow people still got very creative. Enter the cult of virginity. Virgin saints were the Kardashians of their time, famous, desired, and inexplicably powerful. Take Saint Agnes, said to be so beautiful that she was dragged naked through the streets, only to be magically covered by her flowing hair. Or Saint Wilgefortis, who prayed for divine ugliness to avoid marriage and promptly grew a beard. Yes, a woman with a beard who became a saint. These weren't just religious stories. They were cultural scripts shaping how women were supposed to view their own sexuality, either as holy sacrifice or dangerous temptation. Meanwhile, in the noble courts, sex was a strange game of power, property, and ritual. Weddings weren't romantic affairs. They were business transactions. Consummation had to be witnessed, sometimes literally. There are accounts of noble couples having their wedding night observed by priests or family members to ensure proper union. And if the couple failed to perform, there were remedies. Aphrodisiacs made from dried wolves' testicles, love potions brewed from menstrual blood, or rituals involving rubbing honey on certain body parts while chanting sacred verses. If you were poor, you didn't have time for honey and chants. You found a mate fast before your teens if possible and hoped for fertility. But fertility wasn't a private affair. Midwives, neighbors, even the parish priest might weigh in on whether your bedroom habits were normal. Sex wasn't behind closed doors. It was a communal issue, a public concern, something everyone had a stake in. And then, of course, there were the trials. In medieval France and Germany, women accused of adultery could be forced to undergo trial by water. Bound and tossed into a river, if they sank, they were innocent, but drowned. If they floated, they were guilty and burned. Some men were subjected to trial by erection. Yes, it was as awkward as it sounds. A man accused of impotence, especially in a noble marriage, might be examined by church-appointed matrons. If he couldn't perform, the marriage could be annulled, and his masculinity publicly disgraced. Even stranger were the legal sex duels. In parts of the Holy Roman Empire, a man and woman could settle disputes with a duel to the death. But to level the playing field, the man had to fight with one hand tied behind his back and standing in a pit, while the woman was allowed to move freely with a club or rock in a sock. These battles could begin over adultery land or claims of impotence, and they were bloody. Chastity belts. Let's talk. The myth goes that knights locked up their wives before heading off on crusade, sealing their lower halves with metal contraptions and keeping the keys on their own chainmail. While there's scant historical proof for the widespread use of such devices, replicas and engravings from later centuries suggest the idea of them was very real and frighteningly symbolic. Whether real or imagined, the chastity belt was a brutal metaphor. Women's sexuality belonged to someone else. But not all was misery. In some parts of Europe, festivals celebrated fertility with overtly sexual symbolism. The maypole dances, the carnival feasts before Lent. These were moments when the rules bent and bodies moved freely. Costumes came off, songs turned bawdy. The same society that burned witches for seduction also let its peasants smear themselves in mud and wine and pretend they were goats in heat for a day. In one bizarre case, a fertility ritual in 13th century England involved women straddling plows naked, riding them around churchyards while chanting incantations. Another required couples to copulate in freshly plowed fields to bless the harvest. These weren't back-alley secrets. They were communal, often condoned by local priests, especially if the crops were failing. And still behind all of this, medieval people dreamed. They dreamed of love, courtly, impossible love. Troubadours sang ballads about longing, and lost knights pledged themselves to queens they could never touch. And young girls carved symbols into apple peels, hoping to divine the name of a future lover. In the same breath as their shame, they whispered fantasies. But fantasies weren't always private. Some noble women kept love diaries, scrapbooks of verses and tokens from secret trysts. And the church. It condemned erotic dreams as sins of the flesh. but also warned that demons could visit at night in the form of succubi and incubi stealing semen or planting monstrous children. Which raises a terrifying point. The line between sexuality and supernatural fear was dangerously thin. If a woman enjoyed sex too much, she might be a witch. If a man had too many dreams of pleasure, a demon might be to blame. Exorcisms, flagellations, prayers against lust. They were all tools used to fight something the medieval world could never quite understand, but never stopped obsessing over. And so as the candle burns lower, you glance again at that scroll. The monk, eyes wide with equal parts terror and curiosity, whispers a phrase that sums up this whole strange tapestry: carnem timere, sed non posse. To fear the flesh, but not resist it. And with that, the doors creak open to a darker, deeper realm, where the body and soul were always at war, and the battlefield was strewn with strange, unforgettable rituals. Your eyes haven't adjusted to the darkness yet, but you follow the monk down a narrow corridor. The air is thick with incense and mold, and somewhere behind a wall, a muffled chant echoes slow, deliberate, and haunting. The monk doesn't speak again. He doesn't need to. You're already deep in the underworld of medieval sexuality, and the further in you go, the stranger the rules become. You pass by a wooden door etched with faded symbols. He stops, nods for you to open it. Inside is a small room crowded with objects, relics, charms, bundles of herbs, and a crude wooden figure with exaggerated anatomy. This isn't a chapel. It's a fertility chamber, part shrine, part folk remedy center, part superstition storage room. Here the church's grip loosens. You've stumbled into the world of the commoners, where sex was tangled not in theology, but in survival, healing, and fear. If you couldn't conceive, it wasn't seen as a biological misfortune, it was a curse or a punishment from God. And if you could conceive too often, that too was a danger. So women, and sometimes men, turned to local wise women for help. These women weren't officially midwives, though they often delivered babies. They weren't priests, but they whispered Latin prayers. And they weren't doctors, but they knew how to mix pennyroyal and mugwort into teas that could quietly end a pregnancy. Some of their methods were effective. Others were dangerous. But in a world where childbirth could kill you, and contraception was forbidden by canon law, they were often the only option. One such woman might rub a mixture of olive oil, honey, and crushed roots on a woman's belly, while chanting words passed down orally for generations. Another might place amulets under the bed made from animal bones or dried frog skins. And if none of that worked, the woman would be told her womb was wandering, a diagnosis feared by many. You shift uncomfortably. Yes, the wandering womb was real medical theory back then. It was believed the uterus could roam freely inside the female body, causing hysteria, choking, or madness. Treatments ranged from sweet-smelling herbs placed near the vulva to foul odors applied to the nose, coaxing the womb to return to its rightful place. Imagine being told your womb was misbehaving and that it needed to be lured back into obedience. But this wasn't just bizarre, it was deadly serious. Because a woman deemed too lustful, too hysterical, or too resistant to childbearing might quickly become a suspect for something far worse. Witchcraft. You hear the word whispered behind you as though spoken by the wall itself. Yes, sexuality and witchcraft were sisters in medieval belief. A woman who was sexually autonomous, especially one with knowledge of herb cycles or healing, was always at risk. If she seduced a man too easily, witch. If she resisted a noble's advances, witch. If she miscarried and the neighbor's cow died the next day, double witch. The link between feminine sexuality and demonic influence was cemented in texts like the Malleus Maleficarum, a 15th century manual on identifying witches. According to it, women were more susceptible to demonic temptation because they were weaker in faith and insatiable in carnal lust. It was a grotesque justification used to torture thousands, stripped, shaved, examined for devil's marks, and burned alive. And yet even in the firelight of these horrors, there were deeply strange practices meant to prevent sexual deviance. Take flagellation. Some religious groups' flagellants whipped themselves publicly, believing the pain cleansed them of sin. They marched through towns chanting hymns and striking their pox until blood soaked their robes. But behind closed doors, this practice took a curious turn. Some believed that physical punishment helped suppress lust, so individuals would beat themselves before bed, hoping to avoid sinful dreams. In some cases, nuns and monks kept thorn-studded cords beneath their garments, digging into their skin throughout the day to purify the flesh. Of course, pain didn't always mean penance. Among the nobility, pleasure and discipline sometimes blended in unexpected ways. Whipping as erotic play wasn't unheard of. Court poets wrote verses about the thrill of domination, and certain love manuals, rare handwritten guides passed between courtiers, described games of restraint, punishment, and reward. These weren't spoken of publicly, but clues exist in artwork margins of books and quietly amended marriage contracts. The line between sin and seduction blurred often, just as it did in the practice of bed inspection. You're ushered into another room now, dimly lit with a single oil lamp. A bed sits in the center, bare, straw-stuffed, and with wooden posts carved into vaguely floral shapes. But it's not the bed that unnerves you. It's the small bench beside it. That bench, you learn, was for the priest, the midwife, or the mother-in-law, anyone whose job it was to watch. In many parts of medieval Europe, consummation of a marriage had to be witnessed, or at least verified. And sometimes that verification was disturbingly literal. The couple would be escorted to their chamber, blessed and undressed. Then they'd be left to it, but not alone. A witness might sit silently behind a curtain or stand just outside the door listening for signs that the union had been sealed. Only after physical proof, sometimes stained sheets, was the marriage considered legitimate. You can't imagine the pressure or the intrusion. But for nobles, heirs were everything. And without proof of fertility, titles, lands, and alliances could dissolve into chaos. For peasants, it was less ceremonial, but no less strange. In some villages, couples would perform symbolic unions during public festivals. In Ireland, the Telltown marriages allowed couples to try marriage for a year and a day. If things didn't work out, they could walk away literally by turning their backs and walking in opposite directions. During that trial year, fertility and sexual compatibility were tested openly, and the community watched with interest. Even more curious was the practice of hand fasting, where a couple bound their hands together before witnesses and declared their intention to marry or just cohabit. In rural areas, these unions were considered valid and were sometimes performed in fields, on bridges, or in front of trees believed to have spiritual power. Nature, in fact, played a strange role in all of this. Certain trees were thought to increase virility. Streams could cleanse infertility. A woman might wash in a spring at dawn on May Day to ensure a fruitful womb. And men, especially those struggling with performance, were advised to sleep with acorns under their pillows or to rub goose fat on their thighs. Some even wore fox testicles in small leather pouches around their necks. And let's not forget the animals. Medieval bestiaries didn't just describe creatures, they ascribed sexual traits to them. The weasel was believed to conceive through the mouth and give birth through the ear. The lioness, it was said, gave birth through the mouth too. These were not just myths. They shaped how people understood their own bodies. If animals could be mysterious and symbolic in their mating, so too could humans. So you sit back, dazed. The monk offers no explanation. He simply hands you a small object wrapped in linen, a charm warm from his hand. It smells faintly of sage and wax. As you unwrap it, you realize it's shaped like a heart. Not an anatomically correct one, but a stylized symbolic shape like those carved on lovers' trees or drawn into the margins of songbooks. It's fragile, strange, full of meaning you can't quite decipher. But it's real, just like everything else you've seen tonight. And the road ahead only grows stranger. You tuck the heart-shaped charm into the folds of your robe, its faint scent clinging to your fingertips, and step once more into the corridor. The air feels warmer now, as if the stone walls themselves are beginning to sweat from the sheer heat of what they've witnessed. The monk has vanished. You're alone again, and the silence hums with secrets. You follow the spiral of worn stairs downward, each step taking you deeper, not just into the architecture of some ancient abbey, but into the layers of sexual strangeness that the medieval world wore like a second skin. And as the door at the bottom creaks open, you're met with something that catches your breath. A collection of masks. Dozens of them strung across the walls like grotesque faces frozen mid-lust or mid-laugh. Horned, grinning, gaping, crafted from leather bone, even fabric stiffened with wax. These were not decorations. These were tools. Tools for festivals, rituals, and sometimes punishments. You're looking at the forgotten theater of medieval sexuality. The line between performance and reality was often non-existent. Sexuality didn't just happen behind closed doors. It was performed, regulated, mocked, and feared in public spaces. And nowhere was that more evident than in the Feast of Fools, the carnivals, and the ever-chaotic rituals of inversion. Once a year, the world turned upside down. The beggar became king, the priest dressed as a woman, and the rules of sexuality, so rigid and severe on normal days, were gleefully dismantled. People wore exaggerated genitals over their clothes, paraded statues of phalluses through the streets, and sang songs so crude they made devout monks blush and fumble their rosaries. But these weren't just wild parties. They were pressure valves. When daily life demanded chastity, obedience, and restraint, these festivals allowed society to unleash the beast, to laugh at its own hypocrisy. Even the church, though disapproving in theory, often turned a blind eye because they understood that without release the people might rebel in far more dangerous ways. And yet, even during this brief window of chaos, medieval sexuality remained tangled in shame and spectacle. Take, for instance, the tale of the Green Man. You might think of him as a leafy face peeking from church carvings, but his roots go deeper. He symbolized fertility, wildness, and untamed male energy. During spring festivals, men would don branches and leaves, smear mud on their bodies, and chase women through the fields. These chases were symbolic of courtship and mating, and yes, they often involved a very real, very physical end. Some historians believe these rituals allowed for semi-sanctioned sexual encounters outside the strict rules of marriage. If a child was born from such a union, it was often quietly acknowledged as a festival baby, not a bastard. It wasn't respectable, but it was understood. Respectability, though, had its own bizarre twists. In noble courts, love was a game, a structured, rule-laden performance where glances were weapons and words dripped with innuendo. Courtly love wasn't about marriage or even consummation. It was about desire, specifically the denial of it. A knight might swear eternal devotion to a lady he could never touch, writing her poems that bordered on erotic, but veered always into reverence. He might wear her token, a scarf, a ring, into battle, claiming her as his muse while sleeping with chambermaids behind closed doors. And the women, they weren't always passive. In many of these tales, the lady is the seductress, the one who tests the knight's honor, tempts him to falter, or demands impossible feats of devotion. Real noblewomen sometimes played along, encouraging multiple suitors, exchanging secret notes, or hosting salons where poetry became foreplay. But this theater of love wasn't without real consequences. If a noblewoman was caught in an affair, punishment could be swift and brutal, whipped, imprisoned, or forced into a convent. Men, too, could suffer banishment duels or worse. One famous tale speaks of a knight who had his genitals publicly mutilated after bedding a rival lord's wife. The instruments of the punishment were displayed at the castle gate for weeks. Still, even in fear, people found ways to indulge. You've wandered into another chamber now, this one darker, cooler, with stone benches lining the walls, and a basin in the center. You realize what you're seeing: a bathhouse. In the early Middle Ages, public bathhouses were everywhere, from the Roman ruins that still functioned to new bathhouses built by towns near trade routes and rivers. These weren't just places to scrub away the filth of the day. They were social clubs, political salons, and sometimes brothels in disguise. Men and women bathed together in some cities, completely nude. Steam clouded the air, music played softly, and attendants offered oils, refreshments, and, if desired, companionship. Some bathhouses had private rooms. Some had beds. And while the church frequently condemned these establishments, calling them dens of temptation, they remained wildly popular for centuries. Even when the bubonic plague made people wary of public spaces, bathhouses continued to operate, albeit with more caution. And when towns began to shut them down, the sexual culture that had thrived inside them didn't disappear. It just moved underground. Underground, like the room you're in now. There's a heavy curtain at the back of the bathhouse. You push it aside and find something that makes your skin prickle: murals. Faded but unmistakable. Scenes of copulation, orgies, and sexual acts that seem to blend human and beast body and spirit. They're painted not with shame but celebration. These weren't warnings. They were worship. This could be a remnant of a pre-Christian fertility cult, or a forgotten sect that honored sex as divine communion. Some scholars argue that such groups survived long into the Christian era, hidden in rural valleys, or patronized secretly by powerful nobles. They believed sex was not just natural, but sacred. That pleasure wasn't sin, it was transcendence. And while these ideas would be crushed under waves of orthodoxy, they lingered like smoke in forgotten corners of medieval culture, in the songs of wandering minstrels, in the herbal spells whispered by village midwives, in the midnight rendezvous in stables, cloisters, and behind cathedral columns. You sit now on one of the benches, the scent of old oils and wet stone surrounding you. You wonder what it must have felt like to be a young woman brought here for the first time, or a lonely merchant far from home seeking not just flesh, but warmth. You imagine the eyes that looked upon these murals with awe or terror. You wonder how many hands pressed into the same walls seeking release or meaning, or just the chance to feel something real. Because that's the strangest part of all. Behind every bizarre belief, every punishment, every celebration or condemnation, there was a person, a body, a heart beating fast in the dark, not so different from yours. And as you rise to your feet, you realize you're not just walking through history. You're walking through the echo of every suppressed kiss, every secret desire, every weird, wild ritual that made life bearable in a world obsessed with sin. The mural behind you still pulses in your mind as you leave the chamber. Though faded by time, the imagery had a strange clarity, as if it were drawn not with pigment, but memory. You're walking now through a narrow passage that seems to twist and slope, lit only by small crevices where the moon leaks in. The air grows heavier, more pungent, until the scent becomes unmistakable perfume mixed with sweat and smoke. You've arrived somewhere deeply human. The room opens before you like a flower at dusk. Velvet cushions, low tables, and hanging fabrics that move with the slightest breath of air. And in the center, a bed large and low to the ground, draped in linens so worn they're practically translucent. This is not a noble's chamber. It's a brothel. But not just any brothel, a medieval one. The kind you wouldn't find in the records of kings or the notes of priests. The kind known only to travelers and soldiers, poets and beggars, the drifting souls who traded coin for comfort in cities that never truly slept. In this space, sexuality wasn't sacred or sinful, it was currency. Transactional plain but never boring. Medieval brothels varied wildly depending on the city, the century, and the attitudes of local rulers. Some were government-regulated, taxed, and licensed. Others operated illegally in back alleys or inside bathhouses. And still others walked the line between tolerated and taboo, rated one week, protected the next. In Paris, brothels were often located near universities catering to students who were supposedly studying theology by day and indulging in divine pleasures by night. In London, Southwark became infamous for its stews, a nickname for bathhouses turned brothels, where sex was paired with warm water and overpriced ale. The Bishop of Winchester owned much of that land, earning the prostitutes the nickname Winchester geese, an ironic twist given that the church also tried to condemn them. Inside these places, the rules were unique. Women weren't just selling sex, they were selling escape. For a brief moment, a cobbler might become a nobleman. A widow might be reminded she still had a body. A soldier might forget the screams of the battlefield. And the workers, they knew this dance well. Some had been forced into it, sold by desperate families, or abandoned after bearing illegitimate children. Others chose it preferring a life of coin and control over the instability of marriage. In some rare cities like Avignon, brothel workers formed unions. They set prices, protected one another, and even hired guards. It wasn't liberation, but it was structure. In a world where women were often voiceless here, they spoke in whispers that echoed. Their techniques weren't just physical. They mastered the art of the story. A woman might pose as a noble lady exiled from her homeland, weaving tales of court life between kisses. Another might offer magical tokens, a lock of hair, a love spell scribbled on parchment, a drop of perfume laced with rose and myrrh sold as a charm to win a lover's loyalty. Some even passed themselves off as witches promising fertility to the barren or virility to the old. And among all this strange customs emerged. In certain German brothels, a feast of fools tradition played out nightly. Clients would roll dice to determine what services they'd receive. If the roll pleased the queen of the house, they might be treated to songs, dancing, even poetry. If not, they'd be sent away with mocking chants and no refund. A cruel game, but one that added ritual and chaos to something otherwise so transactional. And some brothels didn't stop at sex, they offered transformation. Clients could dress in costumes, act out fantasies, even swap gender roles. Men might don dresses adopting the speech and mannerisms of women. Women might play the role of knight or pirate. These moments weren't about scandal. They were about freedom, brief, candle-lit escapes from the rigid roles of daily life. But freedom came at a price. The threat of disease always hung in the air. Syphilis, though not yet known by that name, ravaged the bodies of many, and without proper medicine, treatments were barbaric. Mercury ointments, cauterization, or leeches placed on the genitals. Some believed amulets could ward off infection. Others drank concoctions of wine and crushed gemstones, praying for protection. And when the plague arrived, everything changed. Brothels became ghost towns. Workers fled or died, and clients vanished into quarantine. But even in death, sexuality lingered. In the artwork of the time, skeletons danced with naked women. The danse macabre became a symbol of how death spared no one, noble or common, virgin or whore. You run your hand across one of the cushions. It crumbles slightly beneath your touch. The velvet is ancient, but the feeling it evokes isn't. Someone once lay here whispering something soft into another's ear. Someone once wept here. Someone laughed. Someone traded silver for the feeling of being wanted, if only for a night. And in another corner of Europe, far from this brothel, a very different sexual ritual was taking place. You're no longer in the city. You're in a village square at dusk, surrounded by lanterns and masked dancers. A spring fertility rite is about to begin. The dancers wear horns and feathers, bodies painted with spirals and eyes. They circle a great wooden pole, tall and smooth, crowned with ribbons. This is the maypole, and it is not subtle. It is a phallic symbol, clear as day, thrust into the center of the village like an offering to the gods. The women hold the ribbons. The men dance around them. The movement is hypnotic, sensual, and slowly binding, an allegory for union. By the end, the pole is wrapped, the couples are flushed, and the crowd is watching closely. If two dancers seem especially matched, they might slip away into the trees. No one stops them. The elders smile. Children are quietly ushered home. Because this isn't scandal. This is tradition. Sex here isn't deviance or duty. It's survival. The crops depend on it. The animals depend on it. The future depends on it. And so it's honored not in a bedroom, not behind stone walls, but in the open beneath the stars. You lie back in the grass and look up. The sky is thick with constellations. Somewhere a flute is playing a tune as old as time. You feel the weight of history pressing against your chest, not as a burden, but as breath. The strange practices, the rituals, the masks and murmurs, they weren't just weird for the sake of being weird. They were meaning. They were protection. They were rebellion. Because when everything else was controlled, your work, your faith, your body sex was the last wild thing you had. And people, even under the threat of plague or fire or damnation, clung to it. The music fades as the dancers melt into the dark, their silhouettes swallowed by forest and fog. You remain for a moment, lying on the cool grass, the dew soaking into your sleeves, but the earth shifts beneath you. Time slides, and now the field is gone. The trees twist into beams, the stars vanish into smoke, and you find yourself indoors. Again this time not in a brothel or a village hall, but in the high stone arches of a noble household. It's quiet. Too quiet. You realize you're in a lady's chamber, and she's not alone. A servant is adjusting her corset tighter, tighter still, while another combs out her long black hair, murmuring something about figs and honey. In the corner, a priest blesses a goblet of wine, not with a prayer of healing, but one for conception. The lady of the house is preparing not for war or a ball, but for the marital bed. Tonight is her duty, and she dreads it. For noble women, sex wasn't about pleasure. It wasn't even always about children. It was obligation, and it came loaded with scrutiny, fear, and intense social pressure. Her value wasn't her mind, her talents, or even her lineage. It was her womb. Could she produce an heir? That question determined whether she lived like a queen or died forgotten in a nunnery. You watch as she drinks the wine slowly. There's something gritty at the bottom of the goblet. A mixture may be ground herbs, perhaps a charm placed there by a sympathetic maid. The line between medicine and magic blurred easily when your body didn't belong to you. A man enters. He's older, red-faced, well-fed. You know instinctively this is not a man she chose. He's a bartered alliance, a strategic match arranged years ago. He undresses as servants slip out, and she lies down, hands clasped over her stomach, eyes locked on the wooden beams above. She doesn't speak. He mounts. It's over in minutes. No candles are extinguished. No soft words are shared. The only proof it happened is the stain left on the linens which a maid will collect tomorrow and deliver to a family member folded in silence. It will be stored in a chest, perhaps even presented to others as evidence of the marriage's fulfillment. But the true result, whether the union worked, won't be known for months. And during those months, she will drink teas perform rituals, pray before fertility statues, hidden behind crosses, and endure daily examination of her belly and her bleeding. If she fails to conceive, there will be whispers. Was she barren, cursed, possessed, and worst of all, was she impure on her wedding night? You're learning now that the concept of virginity in medieval times was both obsession and illusion. While some believed that a physical breaking of the hymen proved virginity, others knew this was unreliable. So they turned to symbols, rituals, witnesses, blood-stained sheets, bridal crowns, tokens carried from the bedroom to the banquet. In Scandinavia, a young woman might wear red during her wedding feast to symbolize her purity blood as a sign of honor, not shame. In southern Italy, a local midwife might inspect her before the ceremony and issue a certificate of intactness. In England, a virgin bride might be presented with a specific prayer cloth, which she was expected to keep forever. But none of this guaranteed safety, because even rumors of prior desire could be deadly. Take the case of Marjorie of Kent, a merchant's daughter who was betrothed at 16, but seen laughing in a garden with a man not her intended. Her future husband claimed her smile betrayed carnality, and within days the betrothal was annulled. Marjorie was sent to a convent. The man she smiled at disappeared, her crime a look. And yet in stark contrast, noblemen could flaunt mistresses, father dozens of illegitimate children, and still be celebrated. In some courts, they were even encouraged to keep a favored concubine alongside their wife. These women, though socially lower, often wielded significant influence arranging marriages, securing titles, even shaping policies through pillow talk. A few became legends. Agnes Sorel, the mistress of Charles VII of France, walked the court in gowns so low-cut that her breasts were often entirely exposed. Not scandalous, fashionable. She was painted as the embodiment of beauty and fertility, and though she bore multiple royal children, her death was mourned more widely than some queens. In contrast, queens were expected to endure. Endure silence, endure infidelity, endure the humiliation of public accusations if their husbands failed to perform, since the fault somehow was usually pinned on them. Which brings us to the cruel practice of public virility trials. If a noble marriage remained unconsummated, a court could demand proof of the husband's ability to function. Doctors, real or self-proclaimed, would examine him sometimes in front of witnesses. They might administer aphrodisiacs, massage his genitals, or subject him to humiliating tests of arousal. If he failed, his wife could be granted an annulment. But if she still didn't conceive afterward, suspicion turned inward again. She might be subjected to an equally demeaning fertility ritual, such as lying naked under a full moon, while women rubbed her with oils and chanted psalms backward. Or worse, she might be given to another man in secret to see if new seed would solve the problem. And yet, amid all of this scrutiny, medieval people still believed in love. Yes, real love. In the songs of troubadours, in letters smuggled by servants, in rings carved with phrases like Amor vincit omnia, love conquers all. You're led now into a small library tucked behind the noblewoman's chambers. It smells of beeswax parchment and secrets. On one table rests an illuminated manuscript. You open it, careful not to damage the edges, and find it's not scripture or law. It's a book of courtoisie, courtly love. Inside are poems written in Old French and Middle English describing the agony and ecstasy of unfulfilled desire. A knight who watches his lady dance from across the hall. A servant who hides a token beneath his pillow. A widow who wears her husband's ring on a chain between her breasts, whispering his name each night before sleep. These weren't just fantasies. They were reflections of how deeply people yearned, not just for touch, but for recognition, for meaning, for one moment in which the body and heart could align even in defiance of law, of family, of God. You close the manuscript gently, and you realize that for all its restrictions, all its rituals, all its punishments, medieval sexuality was never just about control. It was about longing. It was about trying to claim some piece of yourself in a world where everything else was owned: your land, your name, your future. Sex, for many, was the only part of life that still felt like theirs, even if it was secret, even if it was dangerous, even if it was strange. The flicker of the candle beside the manuscript dances like a heartbeat, throwing restless shadows across the stone walls. You linger there, the weight of what you've just read sitting heavy on your chest. 1,000 stories whispered from those pages, unspoken wants, fleeting touches, forbidden glances. It's strange how love, even wrapped in chains, still found a way to breathe. But not all desire was whispered. Not all lust was veiled behind poetry and perfumed parchment. Sometimes it was shouted from the gutters. You step outside now into the streets of a medieval town, just waking from the slumber of night. It's before dawn. The air is thick with fog, and the lamps swing low, their oil nearly burned out. But there's movement. Slurred singing, stumbling footsteps, giggles trailing around corners. A couple emerges from the shadows, disheveled and flushed the man's belt, half undone the woman barefoot. The street is littered with symbols of the night: discarded ribbons, a broken lute string, a spilled flask. This was a celebration or a fight or both. In the medieval world, nighttime belonged to the unsupervised body. By day, the church dictated, the guild enforced, the patriarch watched. But at night, behind alehouse doors and crumbling fences, the old instincts returned. And sometimes they were encouraged. Certain feast days, like St. Valentine's Day, yes, even then, allowed for playful courtship rituals. In parts of France and England, young men and women would draw lots to determine their Valentine for the year. They exchanged tokens, sometimes even shared a bed for one night. It was supposed to be innocent. It rarely was. But even beyond the official holidays, nighttime gave rise to strange sexual customs. In some villages, men would go charivari, a widow, or bachelor, considered too old or stubborn to marry. They'd surround the house, bang pots, sing bawdy songs, and shame the person into taking a lover, or at least pretending to. The ritual was rowdy, crude, and often cruel. But it reflected a deeper truth: sexuality was not seen as private. It was a public expectation, a communal concern. If you weren't having sex, people wanted to know why. And if you were, they wanted to control it. This paradox shows up most strikingly in the rules surrounding same-sex relationships. The Church condemned sodomy, broadly defined to include any non-procreative acts, with fiery sermons and threats of eternal damnation. Yet the records tell a more complicated story. In many cities, male friendships were intensely intimate. Men slept in the same beds, wrote love poems to each other, and shared affection that blurred the line between platonic and romantic. Sometimes it crossed the line altogether. In Florence during the 14th century, there were entire networks of men who engaged in same-sex relationships. Many were prosecuted. Some were merely fined. Others vanished. But the sheer number of surviving court records suggests that such encounters were far more common than the official narrative admitted. And among women, relationships between women were rarely recorded, perhaps because men didn't notice or didn't want to. But when they were discovered, the response could be brutal. A woman caught living with another woman as a marriage partner in France was burned in the town square, her ashes scattered to prevent veneration. The crime loving someone without a beard. Yet still people tried. They disguised themselves as men. They fled to convents. They spoke in code. They carved each other's initials into candles, wore matching rings, composed secret devotions. Even nuns, cloistered and silenced, sometimes found deep and passionate attachments, documented in letters discovered centuries later, stained with wax and longing. You walk now toward the convent wall, and beyond it, a small orchard where the nuns grow herbs and keep bees. A single candle glows in one of the high stone windows. You pause beneath it and listen. Faintly, so faintly, a voice sings in Latin, not a hymn, but a poem, a love poem. You can't understand every word, but the ache is unmistakable. Desire doesn't die in stone cells, it adapts. And so too did the people who lived on the fringes, the sex workers, the sodomites, the lovers who didn't fit the mold. They created a language, a culture, a way of surviving within a system that denied their right to exist. Some of that survival was pragmatic. Take, for example, the medieval hermaphrodite trials. Cases exist where a person born with ambiguous genitalia was brought before the church to be assigned a gender. The bishop, usually unfamiliar with medicine or biology, would decide based on behavior. If the person acted feminine, they were declared female. If they showed masculine strength, they were ruled male. In some cases, they were ordered to choose a gender and strictly forbidden from acting otherwise. Imagine living like that. Now imagine how many simply didn't comply, who dressed as they pleased, loved whom they loved, and carried the risk every day. Some became legends. Joan of Arc, while not known for sexual deviance, was condemned in part for dressing like a man. Clothing, after all, was never just fabric. It was a declaration of identity. And in a society obsessed with roles, identity was everything. Back in the city, dawn breaks. Vendors begin to roll their carts down cobbled lanes. Bakers dust their loaves. A bell tolls in the distance. But in a tucked-away courtyard, you see a different kind of preparation. A wedding. It's not grand, just a wooden arch draped in ivy, a scattering of petals, a single jug of mead on the table. The bride and groom are young, nervous. She wears a crown of dried flowers. He fidgets with his belt. A priest stands beside them, mumbling the rites. And then the moment comes. The kiss. Except they don't kiss. Not yet. Instead, they both place their hands on a loaf of bread and break it in half. One half is dipped in honey and shared. The other is wrapped in linen and tucked away to be eaten after their wedding night. If it's untouched in the morning, something has gone wrong. It's a symbolic act. But it's also a surveillance tool. because even joy, even union was monitored. And yet, as they touch foreheads and smile just briefly, you realize that not every strange tradition was born of oppression. Some were born of meaning, of trying to make sense of something terrifying and beautiful, of wanting to mark the beginning of something real. Sex in the Middle Ages wasn't clinical or casual. It was a storm, a secret, a sacred fire people carried carefully through a world built to extinguish it. You linger for a while at the edge of the wedding courtyard, the scent of honeyed bread still fresh in the air. The couple disappears into a side room, followed by a knowing glance from the priest and a handful of chuckling elders. There is no privacy here, only ritual observation and the thin, trembling hope that what happens behind closed doors will bear fruit. You slip back into the streets, weaving between wagons and sleepy-eyed merchants, but your path doesn't lead you outward. No, you descend again through a side alley, then through a cellar door half buried in moss. Below, the air turns thick and metallic. A heavy silence wraps around you. You're in a chamber of relics. This place isn't holy, not exactly, but it holds things the world feared or revered with the same intensity they reserved for saints. Here, kept in velvet-lined boxes and behind warped glass, are the physical remains of medieval sexuality. Implements, charms, drawings, and diagrams. You don't know whether to call this a museum or a confession. At the center of the room is a strange wooden device. It's curved, jointed, and unmistakably phallic. You approach it slowly, and the label confirms your suspicion, a fertility sculpture, likely placed at the foot of a marriage bed, not as a toy, but as a symbolic stand-in for the vigor a husband was expected to bring. Sometimes such sculptures were used in rituals passed around by women during solstice festivals, or anointed with oil and buried beneath doorways to encourage conception. Sexual symbolism was everywhere. In Germany, brides carried garlic and wormwood in their bouquets, not just for fragrance, but to ward off impotence. In Italy, a groom might step over a sword after the wedding to demonstrate virility. And in the Balkans, mothers would press bread to their daughters' breasts before marriage to ensure future milk and fertility. These weren't private gestures. They were public performances. Sexuality wasn't hidden, it was encoded. Everything had a layer of meaning. The shape of a loaf, the curve of a shoe, even the embroidery on a sleeve could signal readiness, availability, or caution. In some regions, unmarried women stitched secret messages into their undergarments, symbols only a lover would recognize. And lovers, when they found one another, did not always wait for the church's blessing. Bundling was a custom in parts of Northern Europe where courting couples were permitted to sleep in the same bed but with strict boundaries. Sometimes a board was placed between them. Sometimes they were sewn into separate sacks. And other times the girl's legs were tied together with rope while the sign was expected to lie beside her talking, dreaming, flirting, but not touching. Of course, that was the ideal. Reality was far messier. Many babies were conceived during these chaste nights, and midwives could often predict such births before anyone spoke a word. They noticed the signs, slight changes in posture, a quiet shift in how the girl greeted her mother, a dullness in the boy's bravado. The community always knew. They just pretended not to. And when pretending wasn't enough, a shotgun wedding was arranged, or the girl was sent to a distant convent to recover from a long illness. or the child once born was quietly passed off as the child of an aunt or older sister. But not everyone had the luxury of concealment. You move deeper into the chamber. Another relic catches your eye, a scrap of parchment depicting a courtroom scene. Two figures kneel. A priest looms above them. Below is a Latin inscription roughly translated, "Judged for fornication without cause." It's a record of one of countless trials held in ecclesiastical courts. In the Middle Ages, sex outside of marriage was a matter for the church. A couple caught in the act could be summoned, questioned, and punished. Punishments ranged from fines to public whippings to forced pilgrimages in heavy cloaks or with bare feet. And if a priest was involved, it could be worse. Despite the expectation of celibacy, many clergy broke their vows, sometimes privately, sometimes notoriously. In some areas, it was an open secret that priests kept concubines. Entire villages would know which women were the father's women and which children bore too much of his resemblance. Officially, it was condemned. Practically, it was tolerated until scandal forced the bishop's hand. And yet, these relationships, even when forbidden, were often deeply emotional. In one surviving letter from a 12th century monk to his former lover, a nun named Heloise, the passion is overwhelming. He writes not just of their secret trysts, but of how his soul aches without her. Their love outlasted their sin. Their names, Abelard and Heloise, would echo through centuries as a symbol of tragic, eternal love. You step away from the parchment heart, heavier than expected. Not all sex was joyful. Not all rituals were strange but harmless. Sometimes sexuality in the Middle Ages was a weapon. Consider droit du seigneur, the supposed right of a lord, to sleep with a peasant bride on her wedding night. Whether this was widely practiced or largely mythologized, the fear of it was very real. Stories of noblemen taking young women under threat of violence circulated like warnings. In some communities, marriages were deliberately kept secret until after consummation to avoid drawing the attention of lecherous lords. Or consider the practice of forced inspection. In some rape trials, a woman would be examined by midwives to determine whether she had been violated, a process invasive, humiliating, and based on flawed medical knowledge. The trauma was often worsened by the judgmental eyes of the community. If she fought too hard, she was unruly. If she cried too much, she was guilty. And still, despite it all, women survived. They found strength in sisterhood among midwives, nuns, herbalists, and other women who whispered truths the world didn't want to hear. They passed down knowledge of herbs to ease pain, of prayers that doubled as resistance songs, of small carvings hidden under pillows to chase away bad dreams. One such object rests here now. A crescent-shaped amulet carved from bones smoothed by time. The symbol of Artemis, goddess of the moon and protector of women. It was illegal once to own such pagan charms, but someone risked everything to keep it. And now you hold it gently in your hand, feeling the grooves left by someone's thumb, perhaps a young girl afraid of her wedding night, or a mother praying for a safe birth. Sex in the Middle Ages wasn't just about bodies. It was about fear and hope, control and defiance, pain and connection. It was a secret language passed in silence, stitched into hymns, hidden in songs, and carved into door frames. And it was spoken fluently by those who had no other power. You place the crescent-shaped amulet back in its resting place, careful not to disturb the dust and the door creaks open behind you. But this time no one beckons, no monk, no midwife, just the pull of the path itself, leading you into a hallway lined with mirrors, tarnished, warped, their reflections, distorted, as if reluctant to show the truth too clearly. You step through, and suddenly you're no longer in a museum of memory. You're on a stage. A wooden platform, lanterns swaying overhead, and a crowd murmuring around you in the language of centuries past. You hear laughter, not joyful, but sharp, satirical, cutting. And as your eyes adjust, you see what they're watching: a man and a woman, chained together by the wrists, forced to reenact their sins before the town. This is public punishment, but not for theft or blasphemy, for sex. The Middle Ages didn't just scold private behavior, it turned it into theater. Adulterers were paraded through the streets wearing symbolic costumes, horns for cuckolds, shame hoods for unfaithful wives, donkey ears for lustful monks. In France, a man caught sleeping with another man might be bound backwards on a cart and whipped while facing the crowd, his face blackened with soot. A woman accused of seducing a priest might have her hair shorn, her clothes ripped, and be forced to kneel before the cathedral steps for an entire day. The purpose wasn't just to punish. It was to humiliate. To reassert control over a force society could never fully tame. And the punishments weren't only physical. They were embedded into songs, stories, and jokes passed down in taverns and marketplaces. Whole generations grew up laughing at the fallen, the tempted, the caught. Yet even here, amid the mockery, desire found a way to smirk back. You follow the actors behind the stage, past the jeering crowd, and into the tent where they change. Inside, it's quiet. A woman sits before a cracked mirror, wiping the soot from her face. Her expression is calm, unbothered, because this isn't shame for her. It's survival. She's not really being punished. She's being paid. This is performance, a hired spectacle. In some towns, actors were recruited to fake public penance, ritualized shame designed to scare the masses and make an example. But the performers themselves often lived freer lives than those in the crowd. They knew the rules were a show, and so did the audiences, at least some of them. It's a strange irony: the same crowd that gasped in horror at scandalous behavior also bought dirty joke books and commissioned erotic art. Yes, the Middle Ages had its own brand of explicit illustration. In the margins of prayer books, monks doodled naked figures. On church pews, carpenters carved suggestive scenes under the seats. Stone masons high in cathedral towers left gargoyles with genitalia as exaggerated as their tongues. Some scholars argue these carvings served a spiritual purpose to show the grotesque, the fallen, the corrupt as a warning. But others suspect something more human at work: laughter, relief, a wink in the dark. And it wasn't only art. There were fabliaux, short bawdy tales told by minstrels to entertain crowds. These stories were outrageous, often vulgar, and wildly popular. A cheating wife tricks a dim-witted husband. A lustful friar seduces a baker's daughter with holy water. A farmer hides in a flour sack to spy on his wife and ends up covered in grain and shame. These weren't just for peasants. Nobles listened too. Some even copied them into illuminated manuscripts, as if to preserve the naughtiness under a layer of gold leaf and ink. Desire, after all, was not only a sin. It was a source of humor. and nothing delights the human heart quite like laughing at the very thing it fears. As you leave the tent, the streets outside have quieted. The crowd has dispersed. The lanterns flicker lower now, burning their last. But from behind a closed shutter, you hear a different kind of voice. Soft, breathless, whispering something over and over. You pause beneath the window and recognize the cadence. It's a spell, or a prayer, or both. Inside, a woman kneels before a small wooden figure. It's crude, barely shaped, but unmistakably human. She pours oil over it and murmurs names, perhaps her husband's, perhaps a lover's, perhaps someone long gone. Around her neck hangs a string of knotted thread, a love charm meant to bind the heart of another to hers. Magic. It was forbidden, of course. The church forbade all love potions, sex charms, fertility spells, and yet they were everywhere. Passed from mother to daughter, scribbled into the back pages of cookbooks, sewn into hymns. People turned to magic not because they rejected religion, but because they were desperate. Desperate to be desired, to conceive, to be faithful, to make someone stay. Some of these spells were surprisingly mundane, a mixture of rosemary and wine to encourage attraction, a bath infused with lavender and milk to heal the heart. Others were terrifying, the blood of a black rooster poured over a grave at midnight, nails hammered into the doorstep of a rival's house, menstrual cloths buried under a lover's bed. Women in particular became skilled in these dark arts, not because they were witches, but because they had few other tools. A good spell was sometimes safer than speaking plainly, safer than pleading, safer than being seen. But sometimes magic worked the other way. In certain regions, people believed a curse could cause impotence. If a man wronged a woman, she might close him up, a phrase used in old folk records. His body would no longer respond. His seed would dry. His lust would rot from the inside. And the only cure, finding the woman begging forgiveness and receiving her blessing. Revenge magic. In a world where law rarely protected you, magic was the last court of appeals. And it wasn't all whispered in corners. Some rituals were collective. In Brittany, barren women danced barefoot in a circle under the new moon, calling out the names of saints and lovers. In the Rhineland, young men burned bundles of herbs beneath the windows of women they admired. If the scent pleased her, she opened the shutters. If not, he tried again with different herbs. Consent in its most fragile form. You smile faintly, thinking of it. How strange, how delicate, how desperate and beautiful. Because beneath the rituals and punishments, the shame and the laughter, there was always something deeply tender at the core of medieval sexuality. A desire to be held, to be chosen, to be remembered. Even when the world told you your body was sin or property or inconvenience, you still wanted to be known. And somehow, even then, people found a way. The sky outside the shuttered window has turned the color of cold ash. Morning is coming. But the world is still caught between breath and silence, and your footsteps make no sound as you leave the lane behind. You walk with a strange reverence now, as if the ground itself carries the memory of those whispered incantations. You can still hear her voice, not in words anymore, but in rhythm, in the steady beat of longing that pulses beneath every cobblestone. And then, without warning, you're standing at the edge of another threshold. This one is grand arched stone lined with iron flanked by carved figures that leer and scowl and smirk. You recognize it. A university. But not the kind that fills lecture halls with students in rows. This is older, stranger, more alive with contradiction. Because inside men write treatises on chastity and draw obscene doodles in the margins. They debate celibacy in Latin, then bribe servants to bring women through the side gate after dark. They swear oaths of philosophical rigor while passing dirty jokes on scraps of parchment folded 10 times small. You're in the world of medieval academia. And yes, they were obsessed with sex. Theologians argued whether Adam and Eve had intercourse before the fall, and if so, did it feel different afterward. Physicians debated how many times a month it was safe for a man to ejaculate. Too much, they said, and his brain would dry out. Too little and dangerous vapors would build up in his organs, leading to madness or death. You pause in a vaulted hallway lined with shelves. A young scholar walks past, nose buried in a book, bound in cracked leather. You catch a glimpse of the title De Secretis Mulierum, The Secrets of Women. It was one of the most copied medical texts in the late Middle Ages, written by a man who never married. It claimed to explain every aspect of female anatomy and behavior, from the natural heat of the womb to the shape of the skull indicating sexual appetite. It was part science, part fantasy, and entirely male in perspective. These scholars believed that women were colder than men physically, spiritually, emotionally. Their passion, it was thought, came not from heat, but from vacuum, from a kind of emptiness that sucked in attention, affection, even sin. And yet, paradoxically, women were also seen as more lustful, hungrier, more dangerous when aroused. So, which was it, too cold or too hot? They never could decide. But that didn't stop them from writing thousands of pages on the topic. Entire courses were dedicated to feminine disorder. One common belief was that menstrual blood, if left inside too long, would rot the body and drive women insane. Another insisted that a virgin's touch could repel snakes, but that a sexually active woman could kill flowers by walking past them. Absurd, yes. But these ideas had power. They shaped laws. In some towns, menstruating women were banned from baking bread or entering vineyards. In others, a woman accused of infertility could be examined by a panel of men who would judge her based on tone of voice, clarity of skin, or how easily she blushed. One scholar even proposed that a woman's orgasm was required for conception, and that if she denied her husband pleasure, she could be tried for malicious barrenness. And yet, amid all this pseudo-science and fear, there were moments of startling clarity. A few physicians began to record the experiences of midwives. They wrote of contractions, of cravings, of the pain and joy of childbirth. They described how women prepared their bodies before weddings, bathing in rose water, threading pearls into their hair, reciting ancient rhymes passed down from grandmother to granddaughter. These weren't just medical notes. They were glimpses of something much deeper, a woman's inner life. You pass into the scriptorium now, a quiet hall filled with monks and clerics bent over desks. But these aren't just men copying scripture. Some are scribes, yes, but others are illustrators. And in the corner you find a small stack of unfinished pages, their ink still drying. They're illustrations of lovers, not erotic in the modern sense, but sensual, bodies curved like vines, eyes half-lidded, a hand placed lightly on a collarbone. These images were meant for a book of poems, likely courtly love destined for a noble's private collection. But the care in every line suggests something else: admiration, perhaps even yearning. Not all monks lived untouched by the outside world. Some had fallen in love before taking vows. Some continued to feel desire and fought it with ink instead of flesh. Some, perhaps many, did both. You turn one page and find a sketch of two men lying beneath a tree. Their hands barely touch. Their eyes meet. There is nothing salacious here, only stillness. A stillness that holds so much risk. It may never be finished. You walk on. In the next room, a debate is taking place. Not with voices, but with quills. Two scholars are copying texts that argue whether a woman should be allowed to refuse her husband's touch. One argues no, her body belongs to him. The other quotes Paul, "Do not deprive one another," but adds a caveat: unless she is sick, or afraid, or simply unwilling. The page is torn halfway down. The argument, like so many others, remains unresolved. You find a window seat and settle into the stone. Below, students cross the courtyard, laughing, pushing, singing. One tosses a paper at another, a love note maybe, or a line of verse. And for a moment, everything seems simpler, until you remember what waits for many of them. For the women, marriage, childbearing, obedience. For the men, land alliances, control. And for those who didn't fit, silence, punishment, or disappearance still. They laughed, they loved, they learned. Because even in the midst of regulation and shame, the medieval world still held space, tiny flickering spaces for desire to breathe. A look across a classroom, a letter passed under a cloak, a dream dreamt in a language you were never taught to speak. Desire, after all, is its own kind of knowledge. And in places like this, where ink bled into vellum, where words became wounds and balm alike, that knowledge survived. It survives still. You rise from the stone windowsill, the hush of the scriptorium still in your bones, and descend a spiral staircase that seems to wind backward through time itself. The candlelight fades. The voices of the scholars, the scratching of quills, the scent of parchment and wax, they all vanish as you step into something older, earthier, wilder. You're in a forest clearing now. Not metaphorically, actually. The trees stand tall, their branches locked like conspirators, and in the center is a stone circle, half collapsed, but still pulsing with memory. You see traces of a ritual, long finished wax drippings on stone herbs, scattered like confetti footprints that press deep into the earth. Something happened here. This was a sacred space, before the church, before the laws, before the long, cold hand of doctrine took hold of the body. Here, sex wasn't sin. It was ceremony. In the pagan traditions that lingered long after official conversions, sex was more than pleasure. It was invocation, a means of communing with the divine. The fertility of the land was linked to the fertility of the people, and both were honored in the same breath. At Beltane, the spring fire festival, couples would leap the flames hand in hand, then disappear into the woods to bless the soil with their union. In some Celtic traditions, the High King was ritually wed to the goddess of the land symbolically, yes, but also physically, with witnesses. The union wasn't shameful, it was sacred. But when the church arrived, that worldview was not just dismissed, it was demonized. What was once sacred became sacrilegious. The forest groves became sites of witchcraft. The rituals became blasphemies. And the women, always the women, became dangerous. You reach down and pick up a sprig of rosemary left behind on one of the stones. It's dried brittle but still aromatic. In the medieval imagination, rosemary was tied to memory and to love. Brides wore it. Widows clutched it. Midwives burned it to cleanse the air after birth. And yes, it was sometimes used in love spells to bring a man back, or to keep one away. This isn't just folklore, it's survival. Because for centuries, rural women were the keepers of body knowledge. They knew when it was safe to conceive and when it wasn't. They knew how to help labor along and how to stop it altogether. They had names for parts of the body that men never wrote down, and they taught one another with whispered poems and rituals and herbal cures. But that power was a threat. The church, and later the state, began to outlaw such knowledge. Midwives were increasingly brought under male authority. Physicians, almost always men, began to replace traditional healers. And when women continued to work in secret, they were accused of witchcraft. You step through the circle and into the edge of the village again. A small hut stands nearby, smoke curling from the chimney. You step inside. She's waiting for you. An old woman, bent but bright-eyed, grinding something in a mortar. She doesn't startle when you enter. She nods. She's seen your kind before. On the shelves around her are jars and pouches, feathers and bones, dried roots tied in bundles. You spot a flask labeled moon water, another etched with a symbol that looks suspiciously like a yoni. A string of beads hangs over the window, each carved with a different mark. This is a midwife, a healer, a keeper of hidden things. She shows you her tools without shame. A blade for cutting cords, a branch of mugwort to ease labor pains, a charm to place under the mattress if the husband has been cruel. She tells you without words that this is where real power lives, not in castles, not in cathedrals, but in rooms like this. You glance at a book on her table. Its handmade, crude ink, uneven lines. Inside are drawings of plants, diagrams of wombs, chants for pain, salves for burning. There's even a page titled "For Pleasuring the Husband Without Conceiving." She taps it, then taps her nose, then smiles. It's not a dirty smile. It's knowing. Because pleasure in the medieval world was supposed to be dangerous, especially for women. The ideal woman was silent, obedient, virginal, or if married, fertile and faithful. A woman who sought pleasure for herself was feared, mocked, or punished. The image of the lusty woman appeared often in sermons and cautionary tales, wild hair, open mouth, an apple in hand. Eve, always Eve. And yet, the stories tell another truth. In the Canterbury Tales, the wife of Bath speaks plainly about desire. She marries 5 men. She enjoys sex. She manipulates jokes, commands. She's not punished. She's applauded by some readers, at least. And the stories passed among women, though rarely written down, often centered on clever girls who got what they wanted, who tricked old men into marrying them, who used riddles to test lovers, who made bargains under moonlight and didn't regret it. These were tales of cunning, of survival, of joy. Back in the hut, the old woman pours you a drink, something herbal, warm, bitter, with a hint of honey. You sit with her for a while, and she begins to hum. It's an old tune, older than language, perhaps. You close your eyes and feel the weight of centuries settle in the space between your breaths. When you open them again, the hut is gone. You're in a convent garden now. Stone walls, rose bushes, and a cloistered silence that holds everything still. But even here, especially here, desire lingers. Because not all women chose the convent. Some were sent, some were hidden, some were running. And among the nuns, relationships bloomed. Some were spiritual, deep devotional bonds between sisters who shared everything. Some were intellectual, built on shared reading, letter-writing, theological debate. But some were physical, too. Documented in letters, hinted at in confessions, revealed in moments of scandal. Two women alone in a cell whispering prayers before sleep. A hand on a cheek. A kiss on the shoulder. A love that could not be named, but could not be denied. They wrote to each other, exchanged tokens, carved initials into soft wood and stitched hearts into hems. And though their world offered no space for their love, they made space anyway. Because even behind convent walls, sex was not erased. It was transformed, subtle, sacred, still burning. And so you walk the garden paths, breathing in the scent of rosemary and thyme, listening to the bees, and thinking of all the forms that love took when the world tried to deny it. Sometimes raw, sometimes secret, sometimes sung in harmony between two locked gates, and always, always there. The bees hum like monks in miniature, carrying whispers from flower to flower. You follow the path to a small gate nestled behind the ivy-covered cloister wall. It creaks open without resistance, and you step through into another chapter, another shade of the medieval soul, one where desire isn't subtle and nothing hides in quiet gardens. You're in a marketplace now. Not a serene one, but vibrant, loud, chaotic. The smell of roasted meat, unwashed bodies, damp wool, and herbs. Some medicinal, others intoxicating, wraps around you like a woolen cloak. Traders shout. Laughter cuts through the smoke. And tucked between stalls selling fish and flax, you spot a table lined with items not listed in any holy ledger. Amulets, powders, small clay bottles shaped like pears, snakes, and yes, penises. This is a fertility merchant, and business is booming. In the medieval world, buying a charm to enhance your love life wasn't necessarily scandalous. It was pragmatic. Entire economies quietly thrived on the anxieties and hopes of people navigating desire. There were salves to restore heat to a cold wife, potions to invigorate a husband weakened by work, charms to rekindle an old flame or keep a rival at bay. You pick up a bottle painted with roses and thorns. The merchant raises an eyebrow and explains in a thick regional accent that it's meant to ensure fidelity. The instructions Bury it beneath your lover's threshold during a waxing moon. Recite the names of 3 saints backward and never speak of it again. You set it down gently. Superstition, maybe, but also love or control. Sometimes it's hard to tell the difference. Nearby, a more shadowed stall draws your attention. Behind a worn curtain, you find something rarer, illustrated manuscripts, hidden ones wrapped in cloth, and offered only to those who ask the right way. These aren't Bibles. They're Ars Amatoria knockoffs, translated bits of Ovid crude adaptations of Eastern love manuals, even a smuggled page from the Kama Sutra redrawn with distinctly European faces and hairstyles. The images are as explicit as they are odd positions, depicted with the stiff formality of religious art couples, with expressions that seem more confused than aroused. And yet they were coveted, hidden in chests passed among soldiers, kept under pillows by lonely apprentices. Pornography as a concept didn't yet exist, but erotic illustration certainly did. You ask the vendor who buys such things. He shrugs. Monks, bakers, wives, everyone. And there it is again. The veil lifted, the rolls undone. In the market, everyone is human, and everyone is hungry for love, for touch, for reassurance that they're not alone in wanting more. You leave the market and pass a group of minstrels setting up on the edge of the square. One tunes a lute, another sharpens a quill to copy verses onto scraps of parchment they'll sell for pennies. They begin to sing. The melody is slow, winding like ivy around your ears, and the lyrics tell a story. A man loves a woman who belongs to another. He leaves her gifts, a carved spoon, a walnut shell filled with honey, a ribbon scented with apple blossom. She sends back a pair of gloves, her initials stitched into the lining. They never speak. But every week they find new ways to pass tokens in the market. It's not a tragedy. It's survival. These lovers exist in the spaces between law and custom, between risk and ritual. Their love isn't sanctioned. It isn't clean. But it's real. And that is enough. You move on and find yourself drawn toward the outskirts of town, where the buildings are fewer and the air carries a rawness to it. It's here that people come when they don't quite belong anywhere else. The unmarried, the widowed, the healers, the heretics, and the women no longer allowed at the center of the square. You reach a small cottage ringed with stones and dried corn husks. Inside lives a woman known only as the keeper. No one uses her name anymore. Perhaps she's forgotten it herself. She invites you in with a gesture and offers no words, only a small dish of berries and cream. Around her, the walls are covered in scraps of writing, bits of songs, recipes, prayers. One catches your eye: to feel and not be burned, to give and not be owned, to touch the edge of what is and not be cast away. You look to her and she meets your gaze with something like amusement. She was a lover once, maybe many times, maybe of men, maybe of women, maybe both, maybe neither. She was punished or simply pushed out. And now she watches from the margins, collects the stories no one else wants to remember. You ask if she regrets it. She smiles, and the smile is neither bitter nor sweet, just real. You understand then that for all its brutality and beauty, medieval sexuality was defined by its boundaries, and by the people who danced at their edges, the clergy who took lovers, the wives who sought pleasure, the girls who kissed behind the bakery, the boys who walked too close to each other for too long, the midwives who knew too much, the widows who knew more. They were punished, and they persisted. They were silenced, and they sang anyway. And in their defiance, quiet or loud, they carved out the future. Because the strange practices weren't only about sex, they were about identity, about claiming a self in a world determined to give you only roles, about choosing touch over cold even when the touch came with risk. You look out the cottage window, past the village, past the trees toward the hills, rolling soft and slow beneath the moon. And you know the journey isn't over. There are still stories hidden in crypts and kitchens, in abbeys and alleyways. There's more to uncover, more to remember. You leave the cottage slowly, as if the air itself clings to your skin. The wind has picked up, bending the wheat in the distance, carrying the echo of stories too raw to be spoken aloud. The keeper doesn't watch you go. She doesn't need to. You carry her silence with you now. The road turns rocky again, winding past forgotten wells and mossy stone fences, until you find yourself standing before another doorway. This one is marked not by symbols or carvings, but by sound laughter music, the thump of feet on wood. You've arrived at a hall, and from inside comes a revel so warm, so alive, you feel it before you hear it. A peasant wedding is in full swing. This isn't the world of solemn pacts and embroidered veils. There are no stained glass windows or silk canopies here. Just firelight barrels of cider garlands of dried flowers and the unmistakable scent of roasted onions and sweat. The bride wears red not out of wealth but out of superstition. Red wards off spirits. Red keeps the womb warm. She's young. Her cheeks flushed from dancing, her bare feet scuffed from the dirt. Her groom is even younger, perhaps barely able to meet her eyes. But when he does, he grins. He's missing a tooth. They're both trembling, not from fear, but from something older, deeper. A tremble born of newness, of the unknown. They're being cheered on by the whole village. This is not just a wedding. This is sex sanctioned and sanctified by laughter. Because for peasants, sex wasn't whispered. It was sung. It was danced around, teased about, folded into riddles and harvest songs. On the day of your wedding, the jokes flowed as freely as the ale. The bride might be carried to the marriage bed by a dozen loud, joking friends. The groom might be roasted in rhyme, warned of the storm he's about to endure. And in some traditions, the door was left cracked open, not to spy, but as a reminder, your body belongs to more than just you now. It belongs to your family, to the land, to the cycle. And yet there was tenderness, too. Once the guests had stumbled home, the couple would lie together, still sticky with sweat and smoke, and just breathe. There was no candlelit poetry, but there was touch. Awkward, clumsy, desperate touch. The beginning of a life not shaped by love letters or courtship, but by labor, by proximity, by shared bread and shared blisters. And in that, sometimes love bloomed. You slip out of the hall and follow the trail of laughter down a slope where a group of young girls are dancing in a ring. One of them, maybe 12, holds a flower crown above her head, and sings, "He who plucks the rose too soon will never see it bloom." They giggle. One pushes another into the center, where she has to mime a kiss with a broom handle. The game is innocent, but the meaning is not lost. Girls in the Middle Ages were taught early that their bodies were gardens valuable when untouched, sacred, when fruitful, cursed, if either were mismanaged. Virginity wasn't personal, it was economic, political, a thing to be offered or defended like a fortress. And the rules were brutally clear. A girl caught with a lover before marriage might be whipped in the square. Her parents could be fined or worse, ostracized. But if that same girl became pregnant after being assaulted and did not cry loud enough for neighbors to hear, she might still be blamed. Because silence in the eyes of the law was taken as consent. And yet for all that desire could not be stopped, these girls would grow up and love anyway. They would write names into the dirt with their toes. They would trade buttons and scraps of ribbon and eye contact. They would dream not of fairy tale princes, but of boys who didn't stink of onions, boys who made them laugh. One day one of them might visit the keeper's cottage. Another might sneak a page from a brother's book of love poems. Another might simply feel something stir in her chest when she passed a window lit by candlelight and soft moans. Desire bloomed where it could. Not because it was safe, but because it was needed. You walk along the edge of the field now, where a group of older women are gathered shelling peas and gossiping. Their hands move fast. Their mouths move faster. You catch only fragments, but the subject is clear. Someone's daughter has been caught. Someone's son has been sneaking behind barns. One woman laughs so hard she nearly drops her bowl. The topic isn't shameful. It's familiar. Woven into daily life like embroidery into linen. These women know what the girls don't yet. They know that marriage is often boring, that sex can be both comfort and chore. They know how to fake pleasure and how to demand it. They know how to fix an ache with a handful of crushed thyme, how to test for pregnancy using barley seeds and urine, how to cool a husband who becomes too cruel, and they know each other. This is where the real education happened. Not in churches or courts, but around the fire, the wash basin, the kitchen table. Wisdom passed down through story and joke and warning. You hear one say, "She'll be fine if she remembers not to close her eyes on the first night." Another laughs and replies, "Or if she keeps them closed forever." They cackle like crows, tossing the joke into the air like seed. It grows immediately. And you realize here, too, is a kind of power. Not the power of priests or kings, but the quiet, enduring power of those who have survived their own stories, who wear experience like armor beneath aprons and headscarves, and who remember everything. You move on, and the sky is lavender, now dusted with stars. A man walks beside you silently for a time, and then nods toward a barn. "They'll be there," he says. You don't ask who, you already know. Inside a couple lies nestled in straw. It's not romantic. It's itchy. It smells like livestock. But they're laughing. Their clothes are half off their faces, flushed with wine and youth. You turn away before they notice you, but not before hearing one say, "We'll tell them we were lost." And in a way they were. But in another, they were more found than anyone else. Because in that moment, in that stolen, imperfect moment, They were free. And in the world of medieval sexuality, that was the rarest thing of all. You slip back into the cool of night, your footsteps soft against the earth, the barn fading behind you like a sigh. The path stretches onward under a sky now inked with stars, the constellations sharp and ancient. You walk in silence, holding all those whispered stories in your chest, pressed against your ribs, like old letters folded too many times. And then you hear it again. Music. But not the rough laughter of a peasant feast or the thin melody of a lovesick lute. This music is slower layered, sacred, and strange. A procession winds through a chapel courtyard ahead of you, cloaked in candlelight, their robes brushing stone. Voices chant in Latin. Their faces are hidden beneath hoods. At the center of the line, carried high on a cloth of gold, is something unexpected. A statue of the Virgin Mary. But not the serene, sorrowful figure you've seen before. This one is radiant, her robe parted just slightly, a tiny embroidered flower blooming at her womb. Around her incense coils in the cold air, and the chant rises Ave Rosa sine spina. Hail Rose without thorn. You're witnessing a ritual half liturgy, half longing. One of the many paradoxes that defined medieval ideas about sex and sanctity. Because while the Church condemned desire, it also depended on it. It built entire doctrines around one woman's body, Mary's, and then demanded that no other woman aspire to such holiness. Mary was sexless, perfect, immaculate. All others tainted by Eve. This impossible comparison shaped medieval womanhood in every way. You were either the virgin or the whore. There was no middle path, no space for messy, real desire. And yet desire spilled through anyway. You follow the procession into the chapel, its columns reaching like ribs into the dark vault above. Candles flicker on the altar, and behind it, a fresco you didn't expect, Mary nursing the Christ child. Her breast is visible, gentle, round, and painted with care. This was not taboo. This was sacred. Because while the Church feared the flesh, it couldn't erase its necessity. Women gave birth to saints. Women nursed the Messiah. Bodies mattered. And deep down, everyone knew it. You leave the chapel and descend once more into catacombs this time. The walls sweat with centuries. Bones line the passage arranged in quiet artistry. A skull here, a femur there, stacked with reverence and routine. You walk until the air becomes heavy, and then in a side alcove you see something that stops you still. A small stone relief, crude, weathered, but unmistakable. Two figures entangled. Their arms are wrapped around each other, not violently, not lustfully, but tenderly. There's a softness in their stone lips, a hush in their closed eyes. Someone carved this here, in secret, perhaps, or maybe in devotion. Was it a memorial, a confession, a defiance? You'll never know. But it's clear, even in death, love lingered. Not just marriage love, not just sanctioned love, but real, strange human love, the kind that clung to souls like dew on grass, the kind that no doctrine could ever fully exorcise. And as you leave the catacombs back into air that feels suddenly new, you find yourself wondering about all the people who lived their entire lives in the cracks. The lovers who never got to say I do. The women who found ecstasy in each other's arms, not confessionals. The boys who carved hearts into trees and dared not say whose initials they meant. The wives who learned to guide their husbands' hands. The monks who wrote erotic poetry in the margins of psalters. The widows who found comfort in younger men. The midwives who refused to look away from suffering. The farmers who sang bawdy songs to survive another winter. The whores who taught more about tenderness than all the priests in Europe. They all lived here, in this history. Not the history of kings and battles and papal bulls, but the history of skin breath, hunger, and hope. The history written in the space between the sheets, behind locked doors, in the glances shared across pews. And so you walk now through a city that feels different. You've seen the churches, the schools, the kitchens, the brothels, the forests. You've seen pain and ritual punishment and pleasure. And at the end of all that, what remains isn't scandal. It's understanding. Because to live then, to truly live, you had to carry so many selves inside your body. You were sinner and saint. You were flesh and soul. You were temptation and terrified. You were ruled and rebellious. You were ashamed and unashamed. You were secret and song. You pause at the edge of a bridge, the river below, rippling like silk. A couple passes behind you, their laughter soft, their hands quick to pull apart when they see you. Even now they hide, but only a little, because desire always survives, even in a world that tried so hard to bury it. You linger at the bridge's edge, the river whispering beneath your feet. The water is slow tonight, moving like memory fluid, evasive deep. And as you watch the ripples bend around old stone supports, you realize something: you haven't just been wandering through medieval sexuality. You've been witnessing the lengths people went to in order to feel human, and that more than the rituals, the punishments, the masks or myths, is what echoes through every dark hall and whispered alley. Not filth, not perversion, but the staggering ache to be close even when closeness was forbidden. You leave the bridge behind and follow a narrow lane winding uphill back toward the city's sleeping heart. But before you reach its gate, you pass a building unlike the others. No steeple, no chimney. Just low walls and a doorway painted blue. You step inside. The scent hits you first. Resin lavender and something musky like sandalwood and old parchment. It's a perfumer's workshop. Rows of bottles line the walls, amber glass and thick ceramic, each stoppered with wax or twine. This is no apothecary. This is an alchemist's sanctuary of scent. And in the Middle Ages, smell was a language of desire. A woman might dab rose oil behind her ears before a feast. A man might wear cloves crushed into a linen pouch tied around his thigh. Brothels burned bay leaves and crushed orange peel to cover the smell of sweat and shame. And perfumes weren't merely cosmetic. They were believed to stir humors, provoke lust, calm nerves, even ward off sin. You pick up a bottle labeled simply Venus. It smells of myrrh, cinnamon, and something you can't quite name, perhaps ash, from a burned poem, a love spell in liquid form. The perfumer appears from behind a curtain, a woman with streaks of silver in her hair and a knowing smile. She doesn't ask your name, just offers you a drop on your wrist. You inhale, and for a moment, you feel centuries collapse. You feel the trembling hand of a nobleman about to enter a chamber he's paid dearly for. You feel the flutter in a widow's chest as she brushes against a friend for 1 second too long. You feel the sharp pang of a bride alone on her wedding night, waiting for a door to creak open. You feel the heat of a monk pressing pen to parchment, writing a verse he'll never read aloud. You feel all of it, because scent, like desire, knows no timeline. It moves through the air like breath, unseen, uncontrolled, undeniable. You leave the perfumers with the faint trace of that ancient longing on your wrist. Outside, the city has gone nearly silent. The streets glow with dying torchlight, and in that quiet, the buildings themselves seem to lean closer, as if to confess something. You pass a doorway where long ago 2 lovers met once a week. You pass a stable where a woman once gave birth in secret, the horse's steady breath her only witness. You pass a chapel step where a boy knelt in penance not because he sinned, but because he wanted to sin and didn't. You walk past stories no one recorded. No chronicler bothered with the dreams of the baker's daughter, or the guilt of the friar who liked to watch, or the desperation of the boy who paid 2 pennies just to hold someone's hand. But those stories matter. They are the mortar between the stones of history. And now at last you stand before a threshold you almost missed. A small door, plain and quiet. You step inside and find yourself in a bedroom not lavish, not poor. A single bed, a wooden chest, a candle burned nearly to the wick, 2 cups still warm. A couple lies asleep beneath the blanket, fully clothed, their fingers barely touching. It's not about sex. It never was, really. It's about closeness. The body beside yours, the breath on your shoulder, the quiet knowledge that in a world full of chains and sermons and shame, someone saw you and stayed. This is the heart of everything, and it is here beneath a woolen blanket, in the hush of a room that smells of pine and sleep, that all the strange customs and rules and fears dissolve. Because all any of them wanted from the nun in her garden, to the boy in the barn, from the brothel girl to the noble bride, was this: to be held, to be known, to fall asleep with someone else's warmth close enough to dream beside. The blanket shifts. One figure murmurs. The candle gutters. And then, stillness. Perfect and human. You remain at the doorway, unmoving, watching the gentle rise and fall of their breath. The candle gives one final flicker, then fades into smoke, and with it the room exhales. This right here is the softest edge of medieval sexuality. Not the chaos, not the spectacle, not even the rituals, but the rare, unrecorded intimacy that lived in the lull between survival and sleep. You step back into the night, the air cool on your skin, the city's weight behind you like a dream half remembered. But you're not done yet. The path pulls you forward once more, not toward another town or ceremony or shadowy chamber, but up a low hill at the city's edge, a place of perspective. And what a sight it is from here. The city scattered with rooftops and spires smolders gently in the dark. You see churches and gardens, halls and fields, rivers bending like silver ribbons beneath moonlight. Somewhere down there, someone is laughing. Someone is praying. Someone is touching skin for the first time, unsure if it's holy or wicked or both. And somewhere else, someone is waiting. You sit on a stone bench worn smooth by time and turn over all that you've witnessed, not in facts, not in dates, but in feeling. Because if there's one thing this entire journey has made clear, it's that medieval sexuality wasn't a neat chapter in a history book. It was a maze of contradictions, beautiful, brutal, sacred, profane, regulated, and yet wildly untamed. It was laws written by men who feared pleasure, and poems written by men who worshipped it. It was rituals that controlled bodies and rituals that celebrated them. It was women accused of sin for wanting what men claimed by right. It was men punished for softness, for preference for love that dared not explain itself. It was pain disguised as penance. It was pleasure smuggled in beneath the skin. And it was everywhere. In taverns and temples, in bathhouses and fields, in libraries and bedrooms. It was carved into choir stalls. It was scrawled in the margins of medical treatises. It was woven into bridal veils, passed in market baskets, burned into the flesh of the condemned. And yet, despite every effort to shame it or erase it, it endured. Because sexuality isn't a luxury. It's not decoration or deviance. It's identity. It's belonging. It's the echo of being alive. And the people of the Middle Ages, despite plagues and purges, crusades and inquisitions, were profoundly, stubbornly alive. Even when they were terrified of their own desires, they couldn't stop dreaming. Of touch, of closeness, of being seen without being punished. And when they weren't dreaming, they were inventing, concocting amulets and ceremonies and trials and rhymes, all in the effort to understand something that couldn't be caged. Because the truth, the one they never dared to say aloud, was this: desire isn't dirty, but the world often is. And so they made sense of it the only way they knew how, through masks and miracles, through punishment and poetry, through laughter and law and quiet, desperate rebellion. You take a deep breath, and for the first time tonight, you let it out slowly, not because you're tired, but because you feel everything. You look one last time over the sleeping city, this impossible place full of contradictions and candles, and realize you've carried its ghosts with you longer than you ever knew. They were never really gone. They were just waiting for someone to look not at the legends or the lords, but at the lovers. You rise and walk down the hill as the stars begin to fade. The sky softens at the edges. Dawn is near. And with it, the long exhale of a night spent wandering the secret skin of history. You don't speak. You don't need to. You carry it now, all of it. So here we are at the edge of the journey. The cities have dimmed. The candles are out. And all those strange, awkward, tender customs have settled into stillness like dust in the corners of a centuries-old room. You made it. Through the rituals and relics, the fears and fantasies, the contradictions and confessions. You walked beside the peasants and the queens, the monks and the witches, the lovers who whispered in corners and the ones who dared to sing. You heard what history tried to forget, the longing beneath the rules, the humanity beneath the shame. And now it's time to let all of that drift. Let the church bells grow quiet. Let the velvet curtains fall shut. Let the straw beds and herb bundles fade into the dark. You're not in the Middle Ages anymore. You're here safe, warm, still. You've heard their stories, and now your body, this beautiful breathing body, can rest. So close your eyes. Let your breath soften. Let the images dissolve into fog. The maypole dances, the convent gardens, the barn doors swinging gently in the breeze. There's nothing left to know tonight. Only the hush. Only the peace. Only the quiet rhythm of your heart reminding you that you're alive. And that being alive is messy, magical, and more than enough. Sleep well now. You've earned it.